She was carrying a tray of champagne when she heard the lie that was about to cost a dangerous man everything he owned. Gabriella Collins didn't stop walking, didn't flinch, didn't spill a single drop. That was the thing about being a server at the Alderaan, Atlanta's most exclusive rooftop restaurant, 40 floors above Buckhead, like a secret the city kept sealed behind a velvet rope, and a reservation list that stayed permanently full. You learned very fast how to make your face say absolutely nothing while your mind was already on fire. She set the champagne flutes down at table 4, smiled, disappeared back into the white-aproned quiet of the dining room. Then she turned toward table 9, and she listened harder than she had listened to anything in 3 years. Now, before we go any further, if you've ever stood in a room and watched someone get lied to right in front of you and felt that slow crawl up your spine, that do I say something, or do I keep my head down, this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Stay with me, because what Gabriella did next didn't just change her life. It cracked it open entirely, and she never saw it coming. Drop a comment right now. Tell me what made you click on this video, and while you're at it, would you have said something? Hold on to that answer. Because by the end of this, you might surprise yourself. And if you're new here, hit subscribe, because this is the kind of story you don't want to walk in on halfway through. She had memorized the number. Not the way you memorize a phone number or a PIN, casually, out of convenience. The way you memorize something that lives in the back of your throat. Something you carry the weight of every single morning before your feet hit the floor. $47,212. That was Dorothy Collins. That was her mother's name on a billing statement from Emory University Hospital, printed in the kind of clean, bureaucratic font that had no business being attached to something that made Gabriella's chest go hollow every time she unfolded it. The paper had a crease down the center now from being folded and unfolded so many times that the number had started to ghost through to the back. She kept it in the left pocket of her server's apron. Not as a reminder. She didn't need a reminder. She kept it there because it was the only thing that made the Alderaan make sense. The Friday dinner rush at the Alderaan started at 6 and didn't exhale until well past 9, and in the hours between, Gabriella moved through the dining room the way water moves through a channel, efficiently, without resistance, without drawing attention to itself. She had learned that the secret to surviving the Alderaan wasn't speed. It wasn't memory, though you needed both of those things in abundance. The secret was disappearing. Making yourself so precisely competent, so frictionlessly present, that the men at these tables registered you approximately the way they registered the ambient lighting. Useful, invisible, unworthy of a second look. She said a Wagyu Carpaccio in front of a man who was already 3 sentences into a story he was telling someone else, and he didn't pause, didn't glance up, didn't acknowledge that a plate had materialized in front of him. Gabriella straightened, tucked her tray under her arm, let her face say absolutely nothing. 6 months she had worked here. 6 months of 8-hour shifts on marble floors that looked elegant and felt, by hour 5, like standing on a slab of cold concrete. 6 months of memorizing allergy matrices and wine pairings, and which regular at which table preferred their water still versus sparkling, and whether they wanted to be greeted by name or left to the comfortable fiction that no one here knew who they were. 6 months of Gerald Chen's pre-shift briefings, which were less briefings and more daily auditions for a role Gabriella had already been cast in and could not afford to lose. Gerald ran the Alderaan floor the way certain men run things when they have been given a small amount of power and have decided it feels like a large amount. He was precise, particular, and had an uncanny ability to appear at your elbow at the exact moment you were 3 seconds from handling something perfectly. Collins, he had materialized beside her at the service station at 5:58, clipboard in hand, voice pitched low enough to be private and clipped enough to communicate displeasure without using a single impolite word. Table 9 is confirmed for 8, private dining, 3 guests plus a 4th arriving separately. You're assigned. Gabriella looked up from her station layout. The whole section. The whole room. Mr. Sio's party has specific requirements around discretion. He said discretion the way people say it when they mean don't ask questions, don't linger, don't exist unless summoned. Think you can manage invisible. He meant it as an instruction. Gabriella heard it as the easiest thing anyone had asked her in 6 months. "Yes," she said, "I can manage invisible." She was invisible by necessity. She needed this job. But the question that had been sitting at the bottom of her mind since she first tied this apron, the one she had never once let herself answer out loud, was how much longer she could afford to need it. The bill in her pocket was 3 weeks old. The number on it was not. Dorothy's oncologist at Emory, a careful, precise man named Dr. Ose, who chose his words with the same deliberate economy that Gabriella had once used to build legal translation briefs, had laid out the next phase of treatment in the kind of calm, factual language that is only possible when someone has delivered the same category of news many times before. The prognosis was cautiously optimistic. The treatment protocol was aggressive. The window for the best outcomes was, he said, in the next 90 days. 90 days was a number Gabriella could work with. $47,000 was a number that made the floor feel unsteady. Her tips from a strong Friday night at the Alderan ran between $300 and $400. On exceptional nights, the kind that required a private dining room and a contracted discretion fee that never appeared on any bill she was shown, she had cleared $550. She was good at her job. She was fast, accurate, unobtrusive. Gerald did not compliment his staff, but he had assigned her to the private dining section 3 Fridays running, which at the Alderan was the equivalent of a standing ovation. She was doing the math again. She was always doing the math. When table 6 called for another bottle of the Barolo, and she filed the numbers back into the left pocket of her apron alongside the bill and moved. There was a version of Gabriella Collins's life in which she would have been the one sitting at table 6, or table 9. She would have arrived with a briefcase and a bilingual contract summary and a reputation that walked into the room approximately 15 seconds before she did. She had been building that version for 11 years, undergraduate linguistics at Spelman, a master's certification from Georgetown, 3 years of apprenticeship under one of the most respected legal translators in the Southeast, and then her own firm. Small at first, then not small. Rendell Collins Language Services had 6 employees, 4 active corporate retainer clients, and a waiting list when Callum Rendell decided that wasn't enough. She didn't think about Callum during service. She had a rule about that, a strict, deliberate rule, the kind you have to remake every morning because the mind is not naturally tidy about the things that hurt it. During service, she thought about the table, the order, the timing, the quiet arithmetic of keeping everything moving without letting anything show. But sometimes, in the 30 seconds between clearing a table and picking up the next order, a cufflink would catch the light in a particular way, or she would catch the particular dry scent of mahogany and expensive ink, and something in her chest would go very still and very cold for exactly 1 breath. And then she would pick up the tray and move. How did a corporate pro end up here? That's the question you're already asking. Hold it, because the answer is coming, and it's worse than you think. By 7:45, the main floor was at full capacity and humming at the particular frequency that meant everything was going exactly right, and Gabriella could afford to direct half her attention to the private dining room at the back. She had already set table 9, white linen, pressed flat, stemware that caught the ambient light and held it. A single low arrangement of white orchids she had repositioned twice until it sat at the exact angle that allowed sightlines across the table without obstruction. The German contract lawyer, a silver-haired, briefcase-carrying man who had given his name to the reservation desk as Conrad Brower, had arrived at 7:30 and was currently nursing a still water and reviewing documents with the focused, unhurried air of someone who had decided long ago that impatience was a form of incompetence. Sebastian Holt arrived at 7:50 with the ease of a man who considered punctuality someone else's obligation. He ordered scotch, neat, without looking at the menu, and immediately began a phone call that he showed no intention of ending before the other guests arrived. Gabriella refreshed the water, noted that Brower's expression shifted, fractionally, in the direction of contained displeasure when Holt's voice rose above the room's ambient level. She filed that away the way she filed everything, not because she was looking for anything, But because she had spent years in rooms where the distance between what was being said and what was actually happening could cost a client everything, and old habits did not unknit themselves simply because your job title had changed. She was at the service station at 8:03 when the last guest arrived. She heard him before she saw him, or rather, she heard the particular quality of silence that moved with him. The way a room recalibrates when someone with a certain kind of presence walks into it. A table nearby dropped its conversation by half a register. The sommelier, who had been mid-sentence with a guest, glanced toward the entrance and completed his thought slightly faster than he'd started it. Sagang Siak was somewhere in his early 40s. He was not the tallest man in the room, not the most immediately arresting. He was dressed simply, charcoal suit, no tie, the kind of understatement that announces itself precisely because it isn't announcing anything. He walked through the alderaan the way certain people occupy space, as though the geometry of the room had already arranged itself to receive him, and he was simply doing it the courtesy of arriving. His right hand, broad-shouldered, eyes already at the door, positioned himself at the entrance without being directed and did not move again. Siak took his seat, looked at no one, which managed to include everyone. Gabriella picked up the drinks tray. She was almost to the private dining room when she noticed the quality of stillness at table 9, 3 men, 1 contract on the linen between them, and the particular silence of a conversation that was not yet a conversation. She set the drinks, took the food order. Siak ordered in Korean briefly, without looking at the menu. Tristan Vale translated it to her without glancing up from his phone. She wrote it down. She turned to leave. And that was when Conrad Brower muttered it, low, reflexive German, the kind of thing you say when you're not quite talking to the room, but not quite talking to yourself either. Dies sollen stimmen nicht. These numbers don't add up. Gabriella kept walking, her face said nothing. Her tray was level, the champagne didn't tremble. But her mind had already stopped moving entirely. What is at table 9? She was about to find out, and it was going to cost her the only thing she'd spent 6 months trying to protect. She set the tray down at the service station and stood very still for 3 seconds. Not because she was uncertain. Gabriella Collins had not been uncertain about what she heard. Conrad Brower's German was precise, academic, the kind that came from a country that treated legal language like a form of architecture, every word load-bearing, nothing decorative. Dies sollen stimmen nicht. She had translated that particular construction approximately 200 times across her career, in boardrooms and arbitration suites and embassy anterooms, where the difference between what was said and what was recorded could dismantle a company or a reputation or a life. The numbers don't add up. That was not ambiguous. That was not a pleasantry muttered under wine-loosened breath. That was a contract lawyer, reviewing a live document, flagging a material discrepancy to no one in particular because the person in the room who was supposed to be listening was currently scrolling his phone. She picked up an empty water pitcher, turned back toward the private dining room, told herself she was going to refill the water. Tristan Vale had the particular quality of confidence that Gabriella had spent years learning to read in rooms where that quality was often the most dangerous thing present. It wasn't arrogance. Arrogance announced itself, left edges you could work with. Tristan's confidence was smoother than that. It was the confidence of a man who had decided, at some fundamental level, that he was the smartest interpreter of reality in any given situation, and had been rewarded for that decision often enough that the idea of being wrong had stopped feeling like a real possibility. He was leaning back slightly in his chair when she re-entered, relaxed, one hand resting on the table beside his phone, the other gesturing as he spoke, Korean, fluid, unhurried, in the direction of Sagang Siak. Gabriella moved to the far end of the table, lifted the water pitcher, poured, and listened. Conrad Brower had straightened in his chair and opened the contract to a tabbed section near the back. His German, when he spoke, was the careful, measured register of a man making a formal objection for the record, even if the record in this room was only the room itself. He said that Clause 11, cross-referenced with the asset distribution table on page 31, reflected a profit allocation of 60% to the primary facilitator and 40% to the investor of record. He said this was not the structure he had been engaged to review. He said the figure he had been given, the figure on which his client's entire risk calculation was based, was a 50-50 split, equal partnership. He said the discrepancy was not a drafting error. He said it was too precise, too specifically placed within a subordinate clause, to be anything other than intentional. He said he needed this addressed before anyone touched a pen. Tristan Vale listened with the patient, pleasant expression of a man at a restaurant who has just been told the specials and is waiting politely for the waiter to finish. Then he turned to Sagang Seok. And he said, in Korean, smoothly, without a single fractional pause that might betray the distance between what had been said and what he was about to say, that the German lawyer had reviewed the full document and found the financial structure sound. That he had a few minor notations for the secondary appendix, largely procedural. That he was satisfied with the terms as presented and saw no obstacles to moving forward. The room didn't change. Sebastian Holt nodded with the satisfied weight of a man whose expectations had been confirmed. Conrad Brower turned back to his documents, apparently unaware that his objection had just been translated into its own erasure. Seok made a small sound, not agreement, not acknowledgement, something more neutral than both, and his eyes moved, briefly, to the contract on the table. Gabriella set the water pitcher down. Her hand was steady. Everything else was not. How loud is the lie when no one in the room can hear it? Loud enough that Gabriella's ears were ringing. She had stood on the other side of this. She needed that understood. When Callum had begun falsifying translations, small ones first, the kind of omission you could almost convince yourself was editorial judgment rather than fraud, she had not known immediately. She had trusted the work because she had trusted the man, and by the time the shape of what he was doing became clear, her name had already been woven so thoroughly into the paper trail that extraction was no longer possible. Only aftermath. She knew what a mistranslation built for profit looked like from the inside. She was now watching one being built in real time, and the man it was being built around was sitting 4 feet away from her, with the composed, unreadable stillness of someone who had no idea that the floor had already been cut from beneath him. She moved back to the service station, set the pitcher down, picked up a linen cloth she didn't need. Can she stay silent? The honest answer, the one she had been refusing to look at directly since the moment Brower's German landed in her ear, was that she had already answered that question once before in her life. She had stayed silent through small discrepancies and minor omissions and the accumulating architecture of Callum's fraud, and the silence had not protected her. It had simply given the damage more time to become permanent. She looked at the folded bill in her apron pocket. $47,000, Dorothy's name, Dr. Osai's 90-day window. She looked at the private dining room. She thought about what it cost to be the only honest person in a dangerous room. Then she thought about what it had cost her the last time she decided not to be. The second exchange came 12 minutes later, and it was worse. Sebastian Holt had taken over the conversation with the ease of a man who considered the room his natural habitat, walking Seok through the operational timeline in English, which Tristan translated into Korean in smooth practice segments. The structure of it was almost elegant, Gabriella thought, in the way that well-constructed deceptions sometimes are. Holt spoke in broad strokes. Tristan's Korean filled in the details, but the details Tristan was providing were not the details Holt was speaking. She caught it because she caught the gaps, the places where Holt's English ran 4 sentences and Tristan's Korean ran 2, the places where a specific number, a timeline, a liability threshold, a quarterly review clause simply did not make the crossing. Holt said 18 months. Tristan said 2 years. Holt referenced a buyout option at the 36-month mark. Tristan did not mention it at all. He was not translating. He was curating, building a version of this deal in Seok's understanding that served the outcome Holt and Vale had already agreed on before anyone sat down. And across the table, Sagang Seok sat in that particular stillness of his and listened to a version of his own future being assembled without his knowledge. Why is the Korean boss so still? Not because he was passive. Gabriella had worked in enough high-stakes rooms to know the difference between the stillness of someone who wasn't paying attention and the stillness of someone who was paying attention to everything. Siak's eyes moved in a pattern she recognized, not across the speakers, but slightly past them. He was listening for something beneath the surface of what was being said. He was hearing, she realized, that something in the room's register was off. He just didn't have the language to locate it. He was sitting inside a lie with no door and no window, and no way to know the walls were closing. She folded the linen cloth, set it on the station counter. Brower spoke again, a third time now, more pointed, his German carrying the particular edge of a professional who was becoming aware that his concerns were not reaching their destination. He referenced the clause number directly, asked, in terms that left no grammatical room for misinterpretation, whether his translation had been conveyed accurately. Tristan turned to him with a smile that was professionally warm and professionally empty, told him in English that Mr. Siak had received his notes and was giving them appropriate consideration, told him the conversation was progressing well. Brower sat back, not satisfied, but uncertain of his ground, because the only person in the room who could tell him whether his words had been accurately carried across the table was the person who had just told him they had been. That was the architecture of it. That was the elegance Gabriella recognized and found revolting in equal measure. Tristan Vale had built a room where the only available measure of truth was Tristan Vale, and everyone at the table had sat down inside it without realizing there were no other walls. The contract sat in the center of the table. Sebastian Holt uncapped his pen. She heard the music before she heard the words, and the music had been wrong from the first note. Gabriella looked at the room, at the pen in Holt's hand, at Brower, who was frowning now at his own documents with the expression of a man trying to locate a sound he can't quite identify, at Tristan Vale's pleasant, patient face, at the contract, which was 31 pages of someone else's careful, deliberate construction being used to dismantle a man who had come to this table in good faith. And at sagging Siak, who was still, composed, watching Holt with the quiet attention of a man who had survived enough rooms to know when something was wrong, and was, in this one, without the single tool he needed to find it. She had the tool. She had carried it for 11 years, and then spent the last 3 trying to convince herself it had been the problem all along. That knowing too much, hearing too clearly, had been what destroyed her. That the safest thing she could do with what she knew was nothing. The pen touched the first signature line. Gabriella picked up a champagne flute from the service tray, walked to the private dining room, set it down at Siak's right hand, leaned in with the practiced quiet of someone who had spent 6 months perfecting the art of not existing, and said, in Korean, low enough that it crossed only the distance between her mouth and his ear, 4 words. He is lying to you. The pen stopped. The room, which had not changed through any of it, through Brower's 3 objections, through Holt's expanding timeline, through Tristan Vale's careful, patient erasure of every inconvenient truth, went very, very quiet. And sagging Siak turned and looked at her. Not with surprise. With the particular, considered attention of a man who has just heard the one thing in the room he had been listening for all along. 4 words. That was all she had said. 4 words, delivered in a register so low they had barely disturbed the air between them, and yet the effect was immediate and total. The way a single hairline fracture will run the entire length of a pane of glass in the instant after impact, before anyone has registered the sound. Sagging Siak had not moved. That was the thing that would stay with Gabriella afterward, in the particular way that certain moments stay, not as memory exactly, but as a physical imprint. The specific quality of his stillness in the 3 seconds after she spoke, because it was not the stillness of shock. It was not the stillness of a man trying to process something unexpected. It was the stillness of a man who had been waiting, patiently, without any outward indication of waiting, for a door to appear in a room he had already understood was sealed. And then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Not at her, not at the table, simply a small, contained downward movement of his chin that said, I heard you. Continue. She had not planned past 4 words. That was the honest accounting of it. She had carried the bill in her apron pocket and done the math for 6 months and built the careful architecture of her invisibility brick by brick. and in the space of 30 seconds, she had walked up to all of it and spoken directly through it. And she had not, in any meaningful sense, thought about what came next. What came next was Tristan Vale. He had not heard the words. She was certain of that. She had calibrated the distance precisely, a professional habit so deeply ingrained it had operated independently of the conscious decision that preceded it. But he had seen the lean. He had seen her mouth move at Siak's ear, and when she straightened and took one step back from the table, his eyes found her with a quality of attention that had nothing in common with the pleasant, managed expressions he had been deploying all evening. This was not the face he showed the room. This was something he kept behind it. Is she about to be fired? Yes. Is she about to be killed? That question hadn't fully formed yet, but it was forming. Excuse me. Tristan's English was smooth, unhurried, the temperature of it perfectly calibrated. He was not looking at Gabriella when he said it. He was looking at the space between Siak and the table, as though addressing the geometry of the situation rather than any of its participants. I don't think our server needs to be. She stays. 2 words, Korean, delivered without inflection, without emphasis, without the smallest indication that Siak had just redirected the gravitational pull of the entire room. He had not raised his voice. He did not look at Tristan when he said it. His eyes were on the contract. Tristan's hand, which had been moving in the direction of his phone, stopped. Sebastian Holt looked up from his pen with the expression of a man who has just heard a sound he doesn't recognize in a house he thought he knew. Brower said nothing, but his pen had gone still, and the quality of his attention had shifted in the manner of someone who had been waiting for the room to catch up with what he already knew. Gabriella stood at the edge of the table and kept her face in the professional neutral she had spent 6 months constructing. Behind it, her mind was moving at a speed that had nothing to do with champagne trays or linen cloths or the careful choreography of the Alderans' dinner service. Siak turned the contract to page 31, set one finger on the asset distribution table, and looked at Tristan Vale. The Korean he spoke was measured and specific, and Gabriella translated it in real time inside her own chest without moving a single facial muscle. Walk me through this number. The one on line 4, in your own words. Tristan smiled. The smile arrived approximately a half second after it should have, a delay so brief that no one without professional fluency in the architecture of deception would have caught it. He's asking about the distribution table, Tristan said, in English, to no one in particular. Standard clarification. The structure is straightforward equal partnership, as discussed. Siak's eyes moved from the page to Tristan's face, with the patience of a man who had all the time available and intended to use it. He spoke again. I didn't ask what it was. I asked you to read it to me. Line 4, out loud. The temperature in the room dropped by several degrees that had nothing to do with the climate control. Tristan's smile held, but his right hand had moved to the edge of the table, not dramatically, not in any way that could be named, and Gabriella tracked it the way she had learned, in a different life, to track the small involuntary movements that preceded the large deliberate ones. Why is Tristan Vale looking for a weapon? Because the only weapon available to a man whose lie has been found is the room itself. I think, Tristan said, the smile now carrying a slight recalibration toward something that wanted to look like patience, there may have been a miscommunication, perhaps from an outside source. His eyes moved to Gabriella, not quickly, not with anything that could be characterized in a report or a complaint, but with the specific, deliberate weight of a man marking a coordinate on a map. Someone who doesn't fully understand the context of what's being discussed. Holt had put the pen down. He was watching Tristan with the expression of a man recalculating. Gabriella did not look away. She had stood in a room once before while a man tried to make her feel like the problem. She remembered what it had cost her to accept that framing. She was not going to accept it again. Line 4, she said. Her Korean was quiet, direct, addressed only to Siak. 60% allocation to the primary facilitating party, 40% to the investor of record. She paused one beat. The contract you were told you were signing reflects an equal split. The silence that followed was a specific kind. Not empty. dense with the weight of several different calculations being run simultaneously by several different people with several different stakes in the outcome. Brower's head came up. He looked at Gabriella with an expression she recognized, the look of a professional who has spent the last 40 minutes experiencing the specific frustration of being in the right and finding the room impervious to it, and has just watched someone else walk in and simply say the thing directly. Halt's recalculation had completed. His face had gone to a place that was professionally neutral and personally very cold. Tristan Vale stood up. Not aggressively. That was the precision of it. He stood the way you stand when you are leaving a table, which was the right move if the move you were actually making was putting yourself between Gabriella and the exit in a way that looked entirely incidental. He straightened his jacket. His phone was in his hand now. She hadn't seen him pick it up, which told her the movement had been practiced, and his expression had completed its transition away from pleasant and arrived somewhere that wore pleasantness like a mask over machinery. "I'm going to have to ask," he said, in English, to the table generally, how a member of the wait staff came to have a working knowledge of Korean contract terminology. It was a good move. She recognized it as a good move. It was designed to shift the room's question from what is in the contract to who is this woman and why is she here, to make her the subject of scrutiny rather than the content of what she had said. Siak had not looked at Tristan since he stood up. He was looking at Gabriella. His expression had not changed in any way she could have described to someone who hadn't been watching carefully. But there was something in the quality of his attention that had shifted, a focusing, a precision, and she understood, in the way she understood language underneath language, that he was asking her something he hadn't yet said. "Who are you?" Not aggressively, not with suspicion, exactly. With the careful, serious interest of a man who had just identified something of unexpected value and was in the process of deciding what that meant. Did the boss just nod? He did more than nod. He was listening. And in Sagong Siak's world, that was rarer than anything money could buy. Gerald appeared at the entrance to the private dining room with the expression of a man who has received a signal he doesn't fully understand, but has interpreted correctly enough to know it requires his immediate physical presence. He looked at the table, at Tristan standing, at Gabriella, and his face arrived at a conclusion that was wrong in almost every particular, but carried the full bureaucratic force of managerial authority. Collins, his voice was the voice he used when he wanted to communicate consequences without specifying them. A word, outside. Gabriella looked at Gerald. Then she looked at Siak. His eyes held hers for exactly 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds she understood, without a single word being spoken, which was perhaps the most fluent exchange she'd had in 3 years, that she was about to be fired, that he was aware she was about to be fired, and that he intended to let it happen. Not out of indifference. Out of the particular, calculated patience of a man who already knew what the next move was and understood that the sequence had to complete itself before he could make it. She set the champagne tray on the service ledge, straightened her apron, walked out of the private dining room with her face arranged in the careful, professional neutral she had worn for 6 months like a second uniform. Behind her, she heard Tristan Vale say something in Korean that she was not supposed to understand. She understood every word, and the cold that moved through her had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She had just told the truth in a dangerous place, and the man the truth was meant to protect had let her walk straight into the consequences of it. Because what's waiting for Gabriella on the street outside the Alderan is not what she expected. And the white business card in her pocket, she hasn't opened it yet. Before we get to what's waiting for Gabriella outside, I want to pause for 10 seconds on something that just happened in that room, because it's more relevant to your real life than you might think. What Tristan Vale did has a name. It's called interpreter manipulation, and it happens in actual boardrooms, legal proceedings, and medical consultations more often than most people realize. A bad faith translator doesn't have to lie outright. They omit a clause. They soften a number. They convert a formal legal objection into a polite observation. And because the people on both sides of the language gap are trusting the bridge between them, nobody checks the bridge. If you are ever in a high-stakes multilingual situation, a contract signing, a medical consultation, a legal deposition, you have the right to request a certified independent interpreter, not the one provided by the other party. Yours. That single decision has protected people from exactly the kind of fraud Conrad Brower couldn't stop tonight because he had no Gabriella in his corner. Now, back to ours. Gerald did not fire her dramatically. That was the thing about men like Gerald. They had refined the mechanics of consequence into something almost administrative. He walked her to the staff corridor behind the main kitchen, clasped his hands in front of him at the precise height that communicated gravity without physicality, and told her in 2 sentences that her services at the Alderaan were no longer required, effective immediately, and that her final check would be processed within the standard 2-week payroll cycle. He did not ask what had happened in the private dining room, which told Gabriella that someone had already told him. "Your apron," he said. She untied it, folded it once, the way she had been trained to fold it on her first shift, and set it on the linen shelf beside the corridor entrance. The bill from Emery was in the left pocket. She retrieved it before she let the apron go, a small, automatic movement, the kind the body makes when it has been protecting something long enough that the protection becomes reflex. Gerald had already turned back toward the floor before she reached the exit. She had been invisible for 6 months. It took him approximately 4 seconds to complete the process. The staff exit at the Alderaan opened onto a narrow service alley that ran along the building's north face before meeting Peachtree Road at the corner. It was 9:47. The dinner rush was still inside, warm and lit, and utterly indifferent to what had just occurred in its margins, and the alley was the particular quiet of a city that has too much noise everywhere else and deposits the silence in its seams. Gabriella stood at the alley entrance and looked at the hospital bill in her hand. $47,212. She had cleared $420 on a strong Friday, past tense. She refolded the bill, placed it in the pocket of her jacket, walked out onto Peachtree Road and turned south toward the MARTA station, because there was nothing else immediately available to do, and movement was better than standing still with the full weight of what she had just done settling onto her shoulders in the middle of a Buckhead sidewalk. The night was warm for the season. Magnolias on the median, their white blooms going ivory under the streetlights. The particular Atlanta combination of money and jasmine, and exhaust that she had grown up breathing and had never fully separated into its individual components. She had walked approximately half a block when she became aware of the car. Who is in the shadows? She didn't know yet, but she knew the car. It was black, American-made, the kind of substantial that announced itself without ornamentation. It had been parked at the curb outside the Alderaan's main entrance when she arrived for her shift. She had noted it in the automatic, peripheral way she noted things that didn't require her direct attention. It was now moving at the precise speed of a vehicle that was not going anywhere in particular, which is a speed that has no legitimate explanation on a Buckhead street at 10 o'clock on a Friday. Gabriella did not alter her pace. She had spent 3 years in corporate environments where the ability to process alarming information without telegraphing that you had processed it was considered a basic professional competency. She brought that same discipline to the sidewalk. Her stride remained even. Her eyes stayed forward. But her mind had already begun the rapid, practiced inventory of a woman who understood that the street she was walking down had just changed its nature. One car, packing, no turn signal, no passenger pickup in progress. She turned left at the next intersection, away from the MARTA line, into the quieter grid of residential Buckhead that climbed away from Peachtree in the direction of the park. The car turned left. There was a second one. She caught it in the reflection of a darkened boutique window, a silver sedan, sitting half a block back on the cross street she had just passed, engine running, parked at an angle that gave it a clean sightline to the intersection. It had not moved when she turned. It didn't need to. It was the second point of a triangle, and she was the third. She thought about Tristan Vale's hand, moving to his phone in the private dining room. She thought about the Korean he'd said as she walked out, the words she had not been supposed to understand. She thought about the particular quality of violence that does not announce itself, that wears the clothing of patience because it can afford to wait. Her breathing remained even. Her mind was not. How loud is the silence when someone is moving through it toward you? Loud enough that Gabriella could hear every individual second. She was half a block from the park entrance when the black car pulled to the curb ahead of her and stopped. Not behind her, ahead. The driver's door did not open. The passenger door did not open. The car simply sat at the curb with its engine running and its presence converting the sidewalk from a route into a question, and Gabriella stood on the pavement with her jacket pocket and her hospital bill, and the full, clear-eyed understanding that the distance between what she had done in the Alderaan and what was currently happening on this street was exactly 4 words. She had said 4 words to a man whose world ran on consequences. And consequences, she was learning, did not wait for the MARTA schedule. She turned across the street. A man stepped out of the park entrance. Not the car, not the sedan. A third point she hadn't mapped, broad-shouldered, unhurried, the particular physical quality of someone who had positioned himself in that doorway before she turned the corner and had been waiting with the patience of a person who was very good at waiting. He looked at her. She looked at him. And then she recognized him. He was the man from the Alderaan's private dining room entrance, Siok's right hand, the one who had taken his position at the door without being directed and had not moved again for the duration of the evening. He was not, she registered now, in the posture of someone closing a distance. He was standing between her and the park entrance with his hands at his sides and his face arranged in something that was not a threat and was not a welcome and occupied the precise, careful middle ground between the two. Behind her, she heard the door of the black car open. She turned. 2 men, not large in the way that announces itself, large in the way that is simply a fact, structural, the way a wall is large. They were not moving quickly. They were moving with the measured pace of people who had already done the geometry and understood that urgency was unnecessary. They were Tristan Vale's. She knew it the way she knew mistranslation, not from a single sign, but from the accumulation of small, precise details that individually meant nothing and together meant everything. The cut of the jacket on the nearer one, too deliberate for casual. The angle of approach, which was managing her movement without touching it. The fact that neither of them had looked at Siok's man in the park doorway, which meant they had already assessed him and made a calculation about him and decided the calculation was acceptable. That calculation, she thought, might be wrong. Why did Siok's men intervene? That was still 15 seconds away. And in those 15 seconds, Gabriella Collins stood on a Buckhead sidewalk and understood something she had not fully understood inside the warm, lit safety of the Alderaan. The truth she had spoken in that room had not stayed in that room. It had followed her out onto the street, and it had brought company. The nearer man spoke. English, Atlanta accented, the register of someone relaying a message he had been given and was not personally invested in. He said that Mr. Vale would appreciate a brief conversation. He said that her discretion regarding the evening's events would be mutually beneficial. He said the car was comfortable and the drive would be short. He said it the way you say things when the saying of them is a formality, and the real communication is the 2 men and the running engine and the careful management of her available directions. Gabriella looked at him. She thought about Dorothy in a hospital bed at Emory with a 90-day window and a billing statement that was already 3 weeks old. She thought about Callum and what it had cost her to be in a room with a dangerous man and make the wrong assessment of her available options. She said, clearly and without inflection, no. The man's expression shifted in the manner of someone recalculating. And then Siok's man moved. It was not dramatic. That was the thing she would remember, the complete absence of drama in it. He crossed the distance from the park doorway to the nearer of the 2 men with the economy of someone performing a task they had performed before, and he said something in Korean that was quiet enough that Gabriella caught only half of it, but the half she caught was sufficient. He said, "These men are not authorized to be here." The 2 men looked at each other. Then they looked at the black car, which had acquired, in the last 30 seconds, a companion, a second vehicle, dark, parked directly behind it with its hazards off and its engine running, and a driver who had not gotten out but whose presence had nonetheless restructured the immediate geography of the street. The nearer man made a decision. He straightened his jacket, looked at Gabriella with the expression of someone filing information for later use. Then he walked back to the black car, and the black car pulled away, and the silver sedan on the cross street completed a U-turn so unhurried it was almost polite. And then the street was just a street again. Siak's man turned to her, reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, extended his hand. In it was an envelope, cream-colored, unaddressed, the paper the particular weight of something that had been selected rather than simply purchased. He held it at the precise angle of something being offered rather than delivered. She took it. He nodded once, returned to the park entrance, and was gone in the manner of someone the city had simply absorbed. Gabriella stood on the sidewalk under a magnolia tree with the envelope in one hand, and the hospital bill's outline pressing through her jacket pocket with the other, and the warm Atlanta night settling back around her as though none of the last 4 minutes had occurred. She looked at the envelope. Cream paper, no name, no address. She could feel, through the weight of it, that it contained a card. What's on the white business card? She didn't open it on the street. She had learned, the hard way, in a different city, in a different life, that some things deserve to be read in a room where you can afford to think clearly. She opened the envelope at her kitchen table at 11:43, at night, with a glass of water she hadn't touched, and the hospital bill unfolded beside it like a witness. The card was cream heavyweight, the kind of stock that communicates restraint rather than economy. No logo, no title, no phone number. On one side, 4 Korean characters printed in a clean, unornamented typeface. On the other, a single line in English. Hanwol, Tuesday, 7 o'clock. No address. She turned the card over twice, set it on the table next to the hospital bill, and looked at both of them for a long moment, the number that was pulling her under and the invitation that was, depending on how she read it, either a lifeline or a different kind of drowning entirely. Then she looked up Hanwol. It wasn't there. Not in any directory, not on any map application, not in the accumulated, searchable record of Atlanta's restaurant landscape, which was extensive and obsessively documented by the kind of people who treated a new opening like a civic event. Hanwol did not have a website, a reservation platform, a social media presence, or a single review on any platform that aggregated such things. It did not, as far as the public record was concerned, exist. Gabriella set her phone down. Picked up the card again. Read the 4 Korean characters on the front. A place where honest things are said. She put the card in the pocket of her jacket, where the hospital bill had lived for 3 weeks, and went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. She spent the weekend doing the arithmetic. Not the emotional arithmetic. She had learned, through the particular discipline of the last 3 years, to defer that category of calculation until the practical one was complete. The practical arithmetic was this. She had approximately 6 weeks of rent covered, a freelance translation contact she hadn't used in 14 months who might or might not still be in a position to offer her piecework, and a mother at Emory University Hospital whose next treatment cycle was scheduled for the 22nd, which was 19 days away. The freelance contact could cover rent. It could not cover the 22nd. She did not make a decision about Tuesday over the weekend. She told herself she was still evaluating. She was experienced enough with her own mind to recognize that this was not entirely true, but the fiction was useful. It allowed her to move through Saturday and Sunday with the careful, forward-facing focus that had kept her functional for 3 years, rather than sitting with the full weight of what it meant that a man whose business was, by any reasonable assessment, considerably less than legal, had sent a car to her street within 40 minutes of her leaving his table. On Monday, she called the freelance contact. On Tuesday at 6:15, she put on her good coat and took the card from her jacket pocket and read the 4 Korean characters one more time. A place where honest things are said. She took the MARTA to Ponce de Leon and walked the remaining 12 minutes. Is this a trap? She had asked herself that question 40 times since Saturday. She had not yet found an answer she fully trusted. Hanwool was on a block she knew, had walked past, in a previous life, on the way to a client meeting at a firm 2 streets over. It occupied the ground floor of a narrow building set back from the pavement by a short flight of stone steps. Its entrance marked by nothing except a small panel beside the door with 2 Korean characters that were not its name, and were not a menu, and were not, as far as she could determine, intended to communicate anything to anyone who had not already been told where they were going. There was no sign. There was no window through which the interior was visible. There was a man at the base of the steps who was not a doorman in any conventional sense, but occupied the space with the particular, practiced stillness that Gabriella had learned to read as a specific category of professional presence. He looked at her. She held up the card without speaking. He stepped aside. She climbed the steps and went in. The interior was the opposite of the Alderaan in every particular that mattered. Where the Alderaan performed its exclusivity, announcing it through height and glass and the deliberate theatrics of a room that wanted you to know it was expensive, Hanwool simply was. Low ceilings, dark wood, lighting that was warm rather than architectural. 6 tables, each set with the kind of quiet precision that suggested the space had been arranged for conversation rather than spectacle. The smell of doenjang and sesame, and something slow-braised that had been in a pot for considerably longer than the evening. Korean jazz from a source she couldn't locate, low enough that it sat underneath the room rather than across it. 3 of the 6 tables were occupied, and the people at them were engaged in the particular quality of conversation that requires the understanding that no one outside the room is listening. A woman in her 50s materialized at Gabriella's elbow, unhurried, precise, with the authority of someone who ran the room rather than served it, and directed her without words toward the table at the back. Sagang Seok was already there. He was standing when she arrived. That was the thing that stopped her, fractionally mid-step. Not the restaurant, not the 6 tables or the low ceiling or the absence of Hanwool from every searchable database in the city. The fact that he was standing. He had been seated, she could see the displaced angle of the chair, and he had risen when she came into his sightline, and he was standing with the patient, unhurried quality of someone for whom the gesture was neither performance nor calculation. It was simply what he did when she entered the room. She filed it away and sat down. He sat across from her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the silence had the particular quality she had first noticed in the Alderaan, dense, textured, the silence of a man who had decided long ago that words unused were not words wasted. Then he said, in Korean, "You should order the jjiggy. She has been making it for 30 years, and she will know if you don't." Gabriella looked at him. "The tofu version," he added, "unless you eat meat." "I eat meat," she said. He almost smiled. It was the kind of almost that was more communicative than the full version would have been. Why did he stand up for her? Not the standing in the restaurant, earlier. Why had Seok's man been on that street within 40 minutes of her leaving the Alderaan, positioned between her and 2 men who had not been there for a conversation? She asked him directly, because she had learned, in 11 years of professional translation and 3 years of consequential silence, that the only thing more dangerous than asking a difficult question was not asking it and proceeding as though you knew the answer. "Your man was on the street before I reached the corner," she said. "That's not a coincidence and it's not a courtesy. What is it?" Seok looked at her with the focused, considering attention she was beginning to understand was simply his default register, not intimidating by design, but by nature, the way a very still body of water is not threatening, but commands a certain alertness simply by being what it is. "I knew Tristan Vale would not let you leave that building without an attempt at management," he said. The Korean was precise, formal in its construction, the vocabulary of someone educated rather than simply fluent. "I made a counter-arrangement." "You made it before I was fired." "Yes." "Which means you knew I was going to be fired." "I knew Gerald had received a signal from the private dining room before you finished speaking." A pause, the length of a breath. "I also knew you were going to finish speaking." Gabriella looked at him across the table of a restaurant that didn't exist, in a city that had spent 6 months not seeing her, and felt something shift in her chest that she did not immediately have a category for. "How?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Because you had already done the calculation." He said, "I could see it. You had been doing it since Brower spoke the first time. The only question was whether the cost of speaking would exceed the cost of silence." He looked at her directly. "For most people it does. You are not most people." The J-Jiggy arrived, steam rising in the low light. The woman who had seated her set it down without ceremony and left without sound. Does he know her real name? She was about to find out. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which was itself a piece of information. Gabriella had eaten enough working meals in enough high-stakes rooms to understand that the quality of silence between two people who have just met tells you more about the nature of what is being built than the first hour of conversation usually does. This silence was the silence of two people who were both, in their separate ways, accustomed to the full cost of words, and therefore careful with them. It was Siak who ended it. "Rendell Collins Language Services," he said. "Southeast Regional Certification, 6 languages, 3 consulate contracts between 2018 and 2021. He did not look up from his bowl. "The embezzlement case settled without criminal charges against you, but the licensing board suspended your certification pending investigation. The investigation closed 14 months ago. Your license was not reinstated." The room continued at its quiet frequency around them. Gabriella set her spoon down. "Gabriella Ann Collins," he said. "Your mother is Dorothy Collins, currently under the care of Dr. Osai at Emory University Hospital." Now he looked up. "You have been working at the Alderan for 6 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days." The silence that followed was a different kind from the ones that had preceded it. "You research me," she said. "I research everyone who sits at my table." A pause. "You were at my table before I knew you were at my table. I corrected for that afterward." "When afterward?" "While Gerald was walking you to the corridor." Gabriella looked at him, at the composed, unreadable face of a man who had just laid her entire dismantled life on a table in a restaurant that didn't exist, and delivered it with the same tone he had used to recommend the J-Jiggy, and felt the particular vertigo of being seen completely by someone you have known for approximately 90 minutes. "What do you want?" she said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, set a single folded document on the table between them, did not push it toward her, did not pull it back. "That depends," he said, "on what you decide next." She looked at the document. She looked at the man across from her, who had stood when she entered a room and researched her life in the time it took Gerald to say 2 sentences, and who ran a world that operated in the permanent shadow of illegality and valued honesty, specifically because honest people were so difficult to find. She thought about Dorothy. She thought about Callum. She thought about 4 words spoken into the ear of a dangerous man, and everything those 4 words had already cost her. Then she reached across the table, and she unfolded the document. The number was $240,000. Annual, with a structured quarterly disbursement, a separate expense account for professional materials, and a clause on line 7 that specified the arrangement could be terminated by either party with 30 days written notice and full payment of the remaining quarterly balance, regardless of termination cause. Gabriella read the document the way she had been trained to read documents, completely in sequence, without skipping to the conclusion before the architecture of the thing was fully mapped. She read every clause, every subordinate condition, every cross-reference. It took her 11 minutes. Siak did not speak during those 11 minutes, did not check his phone, did not perform the particular restlessness of a man accustomed to decisions being made on his preferred timeline. He finished his J-Jiggy and set his spoon down and waited with the quality of patience that is not the absence of urgency, but the disciplined management of it. When she reached the final page, she went back to line 7 and read it again. Then she set the document on the table and looked at him. "This is a legitimate contract," she said. "Yes." "Drafted by an actual attorney." "A different one than the last." The almost smile again, brief and precise. Conrad Brower, in fact. He contacted my office Saturday morning. Gabriella absorbed that. Brower had understood, then, had reconstructed the evening from the wreckage of Tristan's translations, and arrived at the correct conclusion about what the woman refilling his water glass had actually been doing. She found she was not surprised. Precision recognized precision. "The scope is broad," she said. "Personal translator, contract review, real-time interpretation across all business negotiations. That's not a single function. That's a permanent presence." "Yes. In rooms, I would need to know in advance are not safe." Siak looked at her steadily. "I will not insult you by telling you that all the rooms are safe. Some of them are not. You would know before entering which category you were walking into. And if I decided not to enter, then you would not enter. Can she trust a criminal?" That was the question sitting at the center of everything. The one that the $240,000 and the Brower-drafted contract and the Korean jazz and the 30-year J-Jiggy could not answer by themselves. And Gabriella Collins had not survived what she had survived by letting a number answer a question that required a person. "Tell me about the business," she said. Siak was quiet for a moment, not the hesitation of someone deciding what to conceal, but the particular pause of someone selecting the register most appropriate for what they were about to say. "Import and distribution," he said. "Primarily luxury goods, art, architectural materials, certain categories of technology. The majority is legitimate. A portion operates in legal territories that vary depending on jurisdiction." He said it the way a surgeon describes a risk, not minimizing it, not dramatizing it, giving it its precise weight and setting it in front of her to assess. "The contracts you would work on directly are clean. The rooms where the conversations are less clean. I would not put you in those rooms without your explicit agreement each time." "Each time," she said. "Each time. That's not standard." "No," he said, "it isn't." She looked at him across the low-lit table in the restaurant that didn't exist and thought about the specific category of man she was looking at. She had worked, in her previous life, with men who ran legitimate enterprises and lied with the fluency of people who had practiced it, until it no longer felt like lying. She had worked with men who operated in legal gray areas and were scrupulous about every transaction because the gray area was load-bearing, and they could not afford the weight of dishonesty on top of it. Callum had been the first kind. He had worn legitimacy like a coat and stolen underneath it. She was trying to determine which kind Sagang Siak was. "Why honesty?" she said. "In your world, why is it a priority?" He considered this for long enough that she understood the answer was not rehearsed. "Because I have been in rooms," he said, "where every person present was telling a version of the truth that served their own position. You cannot build anything durable in those rooms. Everything constructed there has a weight limit, and eventually someone puts 1 kilogram too many on it and the whole structure fails." He looked at her directly. "I have lost things to that kind of failure. I do not intend to lose more." "What did you lose?" A pause, not deflection. She had learned the difference. The pause of something that had a real answer that was not yet available for this particular table. "That," he said, "is a longer conversation." "Will she take the money?" $240,000 against $47,212. Against Dorothy's 90-day window. Against 19 days, until the 22nd. The arithmetic had never been the hard part. "I need to ask you something," Gabriella said, "and I need you to understand that your answer is going to determine everything that happens after this conversation." Siak set his tea down. "Ask." "Tristan Vale." She kept her voice level, the professional neutral that had carried her through the Alderan and the corridor and the street. "What happens to him?" The quality of stillness across the table shifted by a degree she could feel rather than see. "That's not your concern," he said, not harshly. "Factually, the way you state the load capacity of a structure." "I'm making it my concern," she said. "Because the last time I was in proximity to a man who had defrauded someone with significant resources, the resolution was not proportionate, and I was adjacent to it. I won't be adjacent to that again, not for any salary." Siak looked at her for a long moment. Tristan Vale will be removed from every professional network he currently occupies, he said. His access to future contracts of this category will be permanently closed. He will be aware of why. Another pause. That is the full extent of it. You're telling me the truth. I am telling you the truth. How do I know that? You don't, he said. Not yet. That's what the 30 days written notice clause is for. She looked at the contract again, at the clean, Brower-drafted language of it, at the quarterly disbursement structure that would cover Dorothy's treatment cycle, and the one after it, and the one after that, with enough remaining to begin the process of reinstating her certification. A process she had been telling herself for 14 months that she would begin when the circumstances were more stable, which was the lie she told herself to avoid the truth that the circumstances would not stabilize on their own. She thought about 4 words spoken into the ear of a dangerous man. She thought about what it had cost her. She thought about what silence had cost her before that. I have conditions, she said. Siak did not look surprised. He looked, if anything, as though he had been expecting exactly this and had arrived at the table prepared for it. State them, he said. What are her conditions? 3 of them, each one a lesson she had paid for in full. First, she said, I review every document before it enters a negotiation, not after, not during, before. If I identify a problem with the content, legal, ethical, or structural, I flag it and the negotiation does not proceed until it's resolved. Non-negotiable. Siak nodded once. Second, my name does not appear on any document I have not personally verified, not as translator, not as witness, not in any subordinate capacity. My certification, if and when it's reinstated, is attached only to work I have reviewed in full. She held his gaze. I spent 3 years with someone else's fraud on documents that carried my name. That does not happen again. Agreed, he said, without qualification, without the fractional hesitation that would have told her the agreement was conditional on something unstated. She took a breath. Third, she said, Dorothy Collins, my mother. Her treatment at Emory is covered in full directly from the first disbursement, not reimbursed, covered. Before I sign anything, before I attend a single meeting, before I translate a single word in a single room. That is the condition on which all other conditions rest. The room held its quiet around them, the jazz from its invisible source, the low warmth of the lighting, the smell of 30 years of careful cooking. Siak reached into his jacket pocket, set a pen on the table beside the contract. Turn to page 4, he said. Line 12 is blank. Write the condition in the language you prefer. I will initial it before you leave this table. Gabriella looked at the pen, looked at the man across from her, at the composed, still face of someone who ran a world she had no complete map of, who had stood when she entered a room and put Brower's name on her contract and sent a man to a Buckhead Street within 40 minutes of her firing, and who had just agreed to 3 conditions that protected her in the specific ways that her previous professional life had failed to. She picked up the pen, opened the contract to page 4, wrote the condition in English, precise and unambiguous, the way she had been trained to write things that needed to survive scrutiny. She slid it across the table. He read it, uncapped his own pen, initialed the line and the margin beside it, slid it back. She did not sign it that night. That was the decision she made between picking up the pen and setting it down, the small, deliberate act of a woman who had learned that the difference between a considered commitment and an emotional one was often the distance between the same evening and the following morning. She told him she would have it back to him by Thursday. He said Thursday was acceptable. They finished the tea in the kind of silence that had evolved over the course of the evening, from the silence of 2 people assessing each other into something with a different texture entirely. She was putting on her coat when he spoke. Your license, he said. The reinstatement process with the Georgia Board of Interpreters and Translators requires a formal character review and 2 professional references. He paused. Conrad Brower has already agreed to be one of them. Gabriella went still with her coat half on. You spoke to Brower about my license. He raised it, Siak said. Saturday morning, when he called about the contract. She stood in the low-lit warmth of the restaurant that didn't exist and looked at the man who had researched her life in the time it took Gerald to say 2 sentences, and felt the particular, uncomfortable sensation of someone who has spent 3 years managing everything alone, discovering that something has been managed without her. She could not decide, in that moment, whether it felt like relief or like the first step in a pattern she should be more careful about. "I'll have the contract back by Thursday," she said. She walked out into the Atlanta night. Behind her, through the unmarked door, she heard, faintly, over the Korean jazz, the sound of a chair being pushed back. He had stood up again when she left. She returned the contract on Wednesday. Not Thursday. Wednesday, because she had spent Tuesday night reading it a 4th time and had arrived, somewhere around 2 in the morning, at the conclusion that further reading was not going to produce new information. It was going to produce the illusion of caution in place of the actual thing, and she had spent enough of the last 3 years confusing those 2 categories to recognize the pattern when it was happening. She messengered it to the address Siak had written on the back of the hand-wool card. By noon on Wednesday, a confirmation arrived, not a text, not an email, a handwritten note on the same cream stock as the original card, 4 words in English in a hand that was precise and unornamented. Thursday, Dorothy's account, confirmed. She sat with that note for a long time. Then she called Dr. Osai's office and told them to expect a payment on Thursday covering the full outstanding balance and the next 2 treatment cycles. The woman on the billing line asked her to repeat herself. Gabriella repeated herself, and the silence on the other end of the phone was the specific silence of someone recalibrating their expectations in real time, and it was one of the better silences Gabriella had heard in 3 years. She hung up and opened her laptop and began the reinstatement application for the Georgia Board of Interpreters and Translators for the first time since the investigation closed. The first week was logistics. Siak's operations were run from a suite of offices in a building in Midtown that presented itself, to anyone without reason to look further, as an import consulting firm. The offices were clean, spare, functional, the aesthetic of a place that was serious about work rather than the appearance of work. Gabriella was given a workspace that looked directly onto the main conference room through a glass partition, which she understood immediately was not coincidental. She could see every meeting. She could be summoned to any of them within 30 seconds. She was introduced to 3 people. Min, who managed Siak's schedule with the focused, unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing it long enough to anticipate rather than react. A contracts administrator named Adiz, whose organizational precision was so thorough it bordered on architectural, and a security coordinator who gave only his surname, Kwon, and whose primary communication style appeared to be the considered nod. Siak introduced her to each of them the same way. "This is Gabriella Collins. She speaks for me. Not translates for me, not works for me, speaks for me." The distinction was deliberate and everyone in the room received it as such. Why is he restructuring his life for her? That was the question Min's expression asked on the first morning, with the careful neutrality of someone who had worked for Siak long enough to know that the word restructuring was not an exaggeration. By the end of the first week, she understood what he meant. The restructuring was not dramatic. It was not the kind of change that announced itself. It was a series of small, precise adjustments, meetings rescheduled to accommodate her review process, documents routed through her desk before they reached the conference table, a standing instruction to every external contact that if Siak was in conversation and Gabriella was present, her word on the English language record was final. 2 ongoing negotiations that had been progressing without translation support were paused pending her review. One of them she flagged on day 4. A distribution agreement with a Singaporean firm whose English language contract contained a liability cap that the Korean summary document had rendered as a liability floor, an inversion so consequential that it effectively reversed which party absorbed risk in the event of default. She brought it to Siak's desk at 4:30 with the relevant clauses marked, and her analysis written in the margin in the precise, economic shorthand of someone who had once done this for embassies. He read it in 2 minutes. Looked up. "How long has this been in negotiation?" "Min's records show 11 weeks, she said. He was quiet for a moment with the quality of stillness she was learning to read as the processing of something that carried operational weight. Then he said, "Fix the language and send it back with a cover note. From you." "From me." "Your name on the cover note," he said. "Let them understand who reviewed it." She returned to her desk and wrote the cover note and understood, as she sent it, that this was also not coincidental. He was establishing her in the record, making her presence in these transactions visible and documented in a way that protected her from the specific category of damage she had suffered before, the kind where the work was hers, and the accountability followed someone else's name. She did not say anything about it. She thought he knew she understood. The coffee was accidental. Or it presented itself as accidental, which she noted but did not yet know what to do with. The second Monday, she arrived at the office at 7:40 to find that the coffee already made in the small kitchen adjacent to her workspace was not the standard office blend that Min kept in the upper cabinet. It was Ethiopian Yirgacheffe, ground that morning, brewed in a French press that had not been in the kitchen on Friday. Black, the way she drank it. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, poured a cup, went to her desk, and began the morning's document review and did not bring it up. It was there again on Wednesday and Friday. She mentioned it to no one. Does he know she takes her coffee black? Yes. The more unsettling question, the one she turned over during the MARTA ride home on Friday night, was when he had learned it, and what else had been learned in the same observation. The reinstatement process moved faster than she had expected. Brower's reference letter arrived at the board within the week. She knew this because the board's administrative coordinator called to confirm receipt with a warmth in her voice that suggested Brower's letter had been the kind of document that changes the temperature of a file. She was 3 weeks into the role when she sat for the formal character review, a 2-hour process conducted by a board examiner who had reviewed her original case and asked questions that were measured and precise and occasionally uncomfortable. She answered every one of them directly. She did not minimize Callum's actions or the damage they had caused. She did not perform the particular rehearsed humility of someone who has prepared a narrative of redemption. She said what had happened and what she had done and what she had not done and what she understood now that she had not understood then. The examiner made notes throughout. At the end of the 2 hours, she said, "Your language retention is remarkable given the gap." "I never stopped hearing it," Gabriella said. "I just stopped using it professionally." The provisional reinstatement letter arrived 11 days later. She read it at her desk in Siak's Midtown offices and felt something release in her chest that had been held at tension for so long she had stopped registering it as tension and had begun to mistake it for her normal state. Min appeared in her doorway 2 minutes later with a cup of Yirgacheffe and set it on her desk without a word and left. Gabriella looked at the coffee. She had not told Min about the coffee. The 5th week was the first real test. A meeting with a Tokyo-based logistics firm, 2 principals and their legal team, negotiating the terms of a distribution corridor that Siak was building across 3 Southeast Asian markets. The contract scope was clean. She had reviewed every document twice and found nothing that required a flag. But the meeting itself was 4 hours of compressed, high-velocity Japanese and Korean and English moving simultaneously across a table, with the particular energy of 2 parties who both wanted the deal and were each trying to want it slightly less visibly than the other. She worked without notes. She had never needed notes in a live interpretation, the architecture of language, the way meaning nested inside syntax and syntax nested inside register and register nested inside the 1,000 small signals of professional intent, had always been as readable to her as sheet music to someone trained to hear rather than simply count the notes. At the 90-minute mark, one of the Japanese principals made a joke in regional dialect that had no clean English equivalent, and that Tristan Vale, had he been in the room, would have either mistranslated or ignored. She caught it, translated the intent rather than the words, and watched the principal's face shift into the specific expression of someone who has just been genuinely understood in a room where they did not expect to be. Siak, across the table, did not look at her. but his posture changed by a degree she was learning to measure. They were in the elevator afterward, the two of them, the agreement initialed and the Japanese team in a car to the airport, when he said, not looking at her, watching the floor numbers descend, the Osaka dialect joke. You translated the architecture of it rather than the content. The content doesn't survive translation, she said. The intention does. A pause. Yes, he said. That's precisely it. The elevator reached the lobby. Neither of them moved immediately. Is she falling for him? That was the question she refused to answer directly, because she had learned, in a life that had required more direct answers than most, that some questions change their nature depending on when you ask them. What she knew was this. He stood when she entered rooms. He had put her name on documents that protected her. He had restructured 11 weeks of negotiation because her review process required it, without once framing that restructuring as a concession. He knew how she took her coffee. And in the elevator, when neither of them moved, she was aware of the specific quality of shared silence between two people who are both, very deliberately, not saying something. 6 weeks in, she came to the office to find her workspace had changed. Not rearranged, expanded. Her desk had been replaced with one that was larger, positioned at a different angle that gave her a simultaneous sightline to both the conference room and Siak's private office. A second monitor. A reference library, physical, not digital, Korean and German and Mandarin legal dictionaries, and 3 volumes of international contract law in original language editions, arranged on a shelf that had not been there Friday. On the desk, a single sheet of cream paper. 4 Korean words in Siak's unornamented hand. She knew 3 of them immediately. The 4th she had to look up, not because she didn't know the character, but because she wanted to be certain she was reading its specific usage correctly. Because in Korean, the same character carried different weights depending on its position in a sentence, and she was not going to misread this one. She looked it up, set the dictionary down, stood at her new desk in the expanded workspace, with the morning light coming through the midtown windows, and read the 4 words again. They did not mean what she had prepared herself for them to mean. They meant something she did not have an immediate response to. She was still standing there when Siak arrived, at 7:52, and crossed the office to his door and paused. Does the desk work? He said. She looked at him. What does the 4th word mean? She said. In this construction, specifically. He held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. It means, he said, what you think it means. He went into his office and closed the door quietly behind him. The developer's name was Reeves Harmon. Atlanta-born, Spelman-adjacent money, the 3rd generation of a real estate family that had spent 60 years acquiring the kind of civic credibility that eventually stopped needing to announce itself. He developed mixed-use corridors in neighborhoods that were transitioning, which was the polite professional language for what was actually a more complicated geography of displacement and opportunity, and the particular Atlanta tension between a city that moved fast and a community that had been there before the movement started. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had learned to be very good at a thing that was not always a good thing, which Gabriella understood was a different category entirely. She had reviewed his company's proposal over the preceding 4 days. $40 million in phased development financing, the funds structured through a Korean investment vehicle that Siak was managing on behalf of 3 silent partners whose names did not appear in the documents she was given, and whose absence she had noted in her margin annotations without pressing for clarification. The English language terms were clean. The Korean language terms were clean. The cross-reference between them was clean. She had checked the cross-reference 3 times. She told Siak on Monday morning that the documents were clear for the table. He had looked at her annotation on the silent partner's clause. Noted, he said, and moved to the next page. She filed that response in the category of things that had a real answer that was not yet available for that particular morning, and prepared for the negotiation. The meeting was in a conference room on the 32nd floor of a tower on Peachtree that looked across Midtown with the particular confidence of a building that had been designed to remind everyone below it of the view they didn't have. Harmon arrived with 2 attorneys and an urban development consultant whose command of financing structure was, Gabriella assessed within the first 10 minutes, significantly more sophisticated than his title suggested. He was 61, silver at the temples, the kind of physical ease that came from a lifetime of rooms that had rearranged themselves to receive him. He shook Siak's hand with the practiced warmth of a man who understood that warmth was a professional instrument. He shook Gabriella's hand and held it 1 second longer than the standard duration. "Ms. Collins," he said. "Gabriella Collins." Not a question. She kept her expression level. "Mr. Harmon." He smiled, brief, unreadable, the smile of a man registering the confirmation of something he had already suspected, and took his seat across the table. Siak, beside her, had not moved, but she felt the quality of his stillness adjust by the precise degree she had learned to read as heightened attention. Why is the developer so impressed? That was the surface question. The question underneath it, the one Gabriella was already running, was how Reeves Harmon knew her name before she had said it. The negotiation opened in English, Harmon's attorneys walking the room through the phased disbursement schedule and the development milestones that triggered each release of capital. Gabriella worked in the register she had found in the Tokyo meeting, not mechanical interpretation, but something more precise, translating the intent and weight of each position rather than simply its content, so that what Siak received was not a transcript, but a complete picture of what was actually being proposed underneath the language in which it was being proposed. Harmon's lead attorney raised the anchor clause first, a performance metric tied to occupancy rates in the first completed phase that would determine the interest structure on the remaining disbursements. The English language was careful, and the framing was reasonable, and the specific figure embedded in the subclause was not. Gabriella translated it into Korean and appended 4 words of her own. "This number is negotiable." Siak's response to Harmon's attorney was pleasant and specific and moved the figure by 8 points without framing the movement as a concession. The attorney looked at his notes, looked at Harmon. Harmon was looking at Gabriella. "Where did you train?" he said, not to Siak, to her. "Spelman undergraduate," she said. "Georgetown certification." He nodded slowly. "I know your work," he said. "Not recent work, earlier, the consulate contracts, the Meridian Group arbitration in 2020. A pause. "You were very good." "I still am," she said. The room held that for a moment. Harmon almost smiled again. This time it reached his eyes. The negotiation ran 4 hours and 40 minutes. By the second hour, Harmon's consultant had abandoned the prepared document structure entirely and was engaging directly with Gabriella's translations, occasionally asking her to slow a specific rendering so he could capture the Korean legal phrasing in his notes. By the third hour, one of Harmon's attorneys had directed 2 questions at her rather than at Siak, and she had answered them, checking with Siak by eye before each response and receiving the slight nod that had become their shorthand for yes, that falls within your authority to address. The shorthand had developed without discussion. She had noticed it developing. She had not stopped it. At the 4-hour mark, a structural disagreement emerged over the liability distribution in the event of a planning authority delay, a scenario Harmon's team considered remote and Siak's documents treated as a primary risk category, which Gabriella had flagged in her pre-meeting review as the most likely point of friction. She had prepared 3 alternative framings of Siak's position, each calibrated to a different response from Harmon's side. She used the second one. The room moved through the disagreement in 11 minutes. Harmon's consultant set his pen down and looked at her with the expression of someone revising an estimate they had arrived at before the meeting started. "How long have you been working with Mr. Siak?" he said. 6 weeks, she said. He looked at Siak. "You restructured your entire negotiation process in 6 weeks." Siak looked at Harmon steadily. "I found someone worth restructuring it for." What is Siak hiding? Not from Harmon. From her. The documents were initialed at 5:47. Harmon's team gathered their materials with the particular efficiency of people who had gotten what they came for and understood the meeting was complete. Harmon himself was the last to stand. He buttoned his jacket, looked across the table at Gabriella, and said, in the tone of a man making an observation rather than a compliment, which she found she preferred, the Meridian arbitration, the mistranslation that collapsed the original mediation. That wasn't your work. No, she said, it wasn't. I know whose it was, he said. The room had mostly cleared. Siak's attorney was at the far end of the table consolidating documents. Harmon's remaining team was at the door. Callum Rendell is in Atlanta, Harmon said, quietly, specifically, the statement of a man delivering information he has decided the recipient needs to have. He has been for approximately 3 weeks. He is working as a contract interpreter for a firm in Buckhead that I will not name in this room. He held her gaze. I thought you should know. He picked up his briefcase. Good meeting, Ms. Collins, he said, and left. The room was quiet for 30 seconds after the door closed. Gabriella sat at the conference table with her notepad open to a page of margin annotations and felt the specific cold that moved through her chest when Callum's name occupied the same physical space she was standing in. She had managed, for 6 weeks, to keep him in the territory of the past, not resolved, not finished, but contained, the way you contain something you do not yet have the resources to fully address. Buckhead. 3 weeks. She became aware that Siak had not moved. He was at the far end of the table, standing, the initial documents in front of him, watching her with the quality of attention that she had come to understand meant he had something to say and was determining the correct moment to say it. You knew, she said. Not an accusation, a reading. The same way she read language, not from a single sign, but from the accumulation of small details that individually meant nothing and together meant a complete picture. The annotation he had looked at on Monday morning. The silent partners whose names were absent from the documents. The fact that Harmon had known her name before she introduced herself, which meant someone had mentioned it, and the only person in the geometry of this meeting with reason to mention Gabriella Collins to Reeves Harmon in advance was the man sitting across the table from her right now. Siak set the documents down. I knew Rendell was in the city, he said. I did not know he was at the firm Harmon referenced. I learned that this morning. This morning, she said, before the meeting. Yes. And you didn't tell me, before I walked into a 4-hour negotiation. The quality of his stillness had shifted into something she had not seen before, not discomfort exactly, but the particular composure of a man who has made a decision he stands behind and is prepared to account for it honestly, regardless of the cost of the accounting. I did not want the information to change how you performed in this room, he said. I needed you to know after, not before. Is the past coming back? It was already back. It had been in the city for 3 weeks, working 2 streets from the Alderaan, and the man across this conference table had known it and said nothing. The question was not whether Callum Rendell's presence in Atlanta was going to intersect with Gabriella's. The question was whether Siak's reasons for managing that information were the kind she could work with, or the kind she had already paid too high a price to accept again. She stood up, gathered her notepad with the focused, deliberate movements of a woman who understood that the next thing she said was going to establish something permanent about the terms of this arrangement. I told you 3 conditions, she said. Before I signed anything, do you remember the second one? Your name on no document you have not personally verified, he said, and full disclosure of any information that affects the integrity of your work. He had added the second clause himself. She had not included it in the original condition. She had noticed that he had added it. She had not said anything about it. Now she understood that she should have asked him then what he considered the boundary of that disclosure, because clearly they had different definitions of the word full. Callum Rendell working in this city affects the integrity of my work, she said. It affects my safety, my professional reinstatement, and my ability to be in any room in this city without the question of his proximity being a factor I'm managing blind. She held his gaze. That is not a small omission. Siak was quiet. No, he said, it isn't. Then why? He looked at her, the direct, focused attention of a man who was not going to look away from an honest question, and said, Because the last time you were in proximity to information about Rendell, you spent 3 years managing the damage alone. I did not want this meeting to be one more thing you carried into that room by yourself. A pause. I was wrong about the method. I was not wrong about the intention. The 32nd floor hummed quietly around them. Atlanta spread itself across the windows in the late afternoon light, indifferent and enormous and full of people who did not know that Callum Rendell was back in it. Find out which firm, Gabriella said. Siak nodded once. And next time, she said, picking up her bag, her voice carrying the full, quiet weight of a woman who had learned precisely what it cost to be managed rather than trusted. You tell me, whatever it is, you tell me first. She walked to the conference room door. Behind her, she heard him say her name, not Ms. Collins, not the professional address he used in every room with other people in it. Gabriella. She stopped. Did not turn around. He doesn't know you're here, Siak said. Not yet, but he will. Someone in his network will tell him, and when they do, he will come looking. A beat. I want you to be ready before that happens. She stood at the door with her hand on the frame and the Atlanta skyline in the window ahead of her, and felt the cold in her chest complete its full circuit. I've been ready, she said, for 3 years. She walked out. The firm was called Langbridge Consulting. Min found it in 4 hours, corporate registration, Buckhead address, a website that was professionally generic in the particular way of companies that want to appear established without inviting scrutiny. Callum Rendell was listed as a senior contract interpreter, his name third on a team page that had the quality of something assembled recently. The headshots slightly inconsistent in their lighting in the way that suggested they had not all been taken on the same day. Gabriella looked at his photograph for exactly as long as it took her to confirm it was him. Then she closed the browser and went back to the distribution agreement she had been reviewing before Min sent the link, and finished the review, and submitted her annotations to Adie's inbox by 6:15, and took the MARTA home. She did not tell Siak she had looked. She understood, without discussing it, that he already knew she had. The following week was the particular kind of busy that has its own quality of mercy, the kind that occupies the mind so completely and specifically that the things living at its edges cannot find adequate purchase. 3 active negotiations in parallel, 2 document reviews requiring Korean-English-German triangulation, and a call with Conrad Brower about a Zurich-based contract that was still in early structuring, but carried the particular complexity of cross-jurisdictional asset language that Brower, with characteristic precision, had flagged 6 weeks before anyone else would have noticed it. She and Brower had developed, over the preceding weeks, the working shorthand of 2 professionals who respected each other's methodology without requiring extensive explanation of it. He sent her documents with his questions already annotated in the margins. She returned them with her responses in a different color. The exchange was efficient and almost entirely free of small talk, which suited them both. On Thursday, he added a single line at the bottom of his annotation that fell outside the document's scope entirely. The Rendell matter. If it becomes professionally relevant, call me directly. Not email, directly. She read it twice. Wrote understood in the margin. Send it back. Is the past coming back? It was already in a building 2 streets from where she had spent 6 months being invisible. The only remaining question was timing. It was a Friday when Siak asked her to stay after the last meeting of the day. Not unusually, they had developed the habit, over 6 weeks, of a brief end-of-day accounting that was part debrief and part preparation for the following week's schedule. It was efficient and had evolved naturally out of the structure of the work, and Gabriella had noted its evolution with the same careful attention she brought to everything in this office without attaching more meaning to it than the evidence supported. She was at her desk completing the final annotations on the Zurich document when Min left at 6:30 with his coat and his characteristic single nod in her direction. Adie's had gone at 6. Kwon remained at the building entrance, as he always did until Siak left the floor, and would remain there regardless of how long the evening extended. At 6:52, Siak came to the doorway of her workspace. He was still in his jacket, which was unusual for this hour. By the end of a Friday, the jacket was typically on the back of his chair, and he worked in his shirt sleeves with the focused, unhurried energy of someone for whom the end of a formal workday was a calendar notation rather than a lived experience. He had something in his hand. A cream envelope. The same stock as the hand-wool card. The same weight. Unaddressed, unsealed, held at his side with a quality of deliberateness that she recognized immediately. Not the deliberateness of someone who had just picked something up, but of someone who had been holding it for longer than this moment and had decided in this moment that the holding was finished. He crossed the office and set it on her desk. Did not sit down. Did not offer context. She looked at the envelope, looked at him. 4 words, he said, in Korean. Read them when you're ready. He went back to his office. The door, which he typically left open during their end-of-day accounting, closed. What do the words mean? She didn't know yet. She was looking at the envelope. The way you look at something you understand is going to change the specific shape of whatever comes after it, and are taking one final inventory of what exists before. She had learned, in 11 years of professional translation, that language was never simply the sum of its words. Every construction carried the sediment of its context, the register in which it was delivered, the relationship between speaker and recipient, the specific weight that accumulated around certain combinations of meaning over the course of a shared history. The same 4 words could mean entirely different things depending on who said them and to whom and after what. She and Sagung Seok had 7 weeks of shared history. She picked up the envelope. The flap was unsealed, which she understood was deliberate. He had not wanted the opening of it to require effort, had not wanted there to be any physical resistance between her and the words inside, which told her something about the words before she had read them. She removed the card. Cream stock, the same unornamented typeface as the hand-wool card, the same precise spacing. 4 Korean characters, and below them, in smaller text, the same 4 characters rendered in English. She read the Korean first, because she always read the source language first. Then she read the English. I am afraid of you. She sat very still for a moment. Not because she didn't understand the words. She understood every dimension of them. In Korean, the construction he had chosen was not the fear of threat or danger. It was not the word used when something was dangerous to you. It was the word used when something had the capacity to undo you. When the thing you feared was not what it might do to you from the outside, but what it had already done from the inside, without permission, before you had determined whether permission was something you were prepared to give. He had chosen that word specifically. Out of every available construction in a language with more precise emotional vocabulary than English allowed, he had chosen the one that meant, you have already gotten past the part of me that decides. She looked at the closed office door. Why is he trembling? She hadn't seen it directly. She had seen what came before it, the jacket still on at 6:52, the envelope held at his side with the quality of something that had been decided and not yet delivered, the door that closed for the first time in 7 weeks. She had read rooms for 11 years. She knew what a man looked like when he was in the presence of the only thing he couldn't manage. She put the card on her desk, stood up, walked to his office door and knocked once, not the professional double knock of someone requesting a meeting, the single knock of someone who is already coming in. He was at the window, not at his desk, standing with his back partially to the door, facing the midtown skyline in the last of the evening light, and she saw in the set of his shoulders, in the way his right hand was not at his side with its characteristic stillness, but pressed flat against the window frame, that the composure she had come to read as his natural state was present, but was costing him something tonight. She had never seen it cost him anything before. She stood in the doorway. The construction you used, she said, the specific character for fear, you chose it deliberately. He did not turn around. Yes. It doesn't mean afraid of what someone might do, she said. It means afraid of what they've already done. I know what it means, he said quietly. I wrote it. She came into the office and stood 6 feet from him, with the Atlanta evening arranging itself across the glass between them and the city, going about its enormous, indifferent business below. "You have been afraid of very few things," she said. It was not a question, it was a translation, the same way she translated everything, reading the language underneath the language. "In a life that has put you in rooms with dangerous people and dangerous outcomes, you have managed fear as a professional instrument, something to be assessed and accounted for and not permitted to determine the outcome." He turned then, looked at her with the direct, unguarded quality she had seen only in fragments before, in the elevator after the Tokyo meeting, in the Han Wool restaurant when she had asked what he had lost, in the conference room after she told him he should have disclosed Rendell's presence. But those had been fragments. This was the full version, and it was different from the fragments the way a complete sentence is different from its individual words. "Yes," he said. "And you can't do that with this." A pause, the length of something being decided. "No," he said, "I can't." She understood, in that moment, what the envelope had cost him. Not the words, the delivery. Sagang Siak did not make himself legible to people. She had watched him for 7 weeks in rooms where every other person was attempting to read him, and finding only the composed, deliberate surface of a man who had decided long ago that visibility was a liability. He gave people what they needed to conduct business, and nothing that would give them leverage over the parts of him that were not business. He had put 4 words in an envelope and set them on her desk. For a man like that, she understood, that was not a gesture. That was a structural change. Will she read it now or later? She had read it. The question the envelope had actually been asking, the one underneath the 4 Korean words, in the language beneath the language, was not whether she would read it. It was what she would do when she had. She looked at him across the 6 feet of his office with the city behind him, and the envelope on her desk in the other room, and 7 weeks of shared mornings and coffee she hadn't asked for, and a desk that had been replaced without discussion, and a man who stood when she entered rooms, and had put Brower's name on her reinstatement without telling her he was going to. She thought about Callum, about what it had cost her to trust the wrong person completely. She thought about the 30 days written notice clause that she had read 4 times and understood was there specifically so that she would not have to trust without an exit. She thought about the 4th word on the note he had left on her new desk 3 weeks ago, the one she had looked up in the dictionary to be certain, and how he had said it means what you think it means and gone into his office and closed the door, and how she had read the same line of a contract 4 times without retaining a single word. "I need you to understand something," she said. He waited. "The last time I trusted someone in a professional context without reservation," she said, "I lost my license, my firm, my savings, and 3 years of my life to the process of recovering from the trust rather than the work." She held his gaze steadily. "I am not going to do that again, not for any salary, not for any restructured office, not for Yurgashev coffee on a Monday morning." "I know," he said. "And I need you to know that I know the difference between a man who values honesty, because it serves his interests, and a man who values it, because he understands what it costs when it's absent." She paused. "I have been watching you for 7 weeks to determine which one you are." The office was very quiet. "And," he said. She looked at him, at the window and the jacket, and the right hand that was no longer completely still against the window frame, and felt the specific, irreversible recognition of a woman who has already made a decision and is in the process of acknowledging it to herself for the first time. "And," she said, "I haven't decided what to do about it yet." She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she walked back to her desk, picked up the cream card, slid it into the inside pocket of her jacket, against her chest, where the hospital bill had lived for 3 weeks until the Thursday it didn't need to anymore. She gathered her bag. At the office entrance she stopped. Did not turn around. "Tuesday," she said. "Hanwool, 7 o'clock." She walked out. Behind her, through the office, she heard nothing. The silence had weight to it. The best kind always did. Dorothy Collins had opinions about everything, and expressed them in the particular register of a woman who had worked 2 jobs for 15 years, and had therefore earned the right to say exactly what she meant without the decorative softening that other people sometimes mistook for politeness. She had opinions about Dr. Osai's parking situation, which she found unconscionable. She had opinions about the quality of light in her hospital room, which improved significantly when Gabriella brought the lamp from Dorothy's bedroom at home and plugged it in next to the standard-issue fluorescent that neither of them acknowledged anymore. She had opinions about the specific brand of tea the floor nurses stocked, about the angle of the television mount, about the novel Gabriella had brought her last Tuesday, which Dorothy had finished in a day and a half and assessed as structurally sound but emotionally timid. What Dorothy had not done, in the 8 weeks since Gabriella started working for Siak, was ask directly about the job. She had asked around it, noted the new coat, noted the quality of focus Gabriella brought to their visits now, present rather than managed, the difference between a daughter who was holding everything together by force of will and one who had found something that was holding some of it for her. Dorothy noted things the way she did everything, completely, without broadcasting the observation, filing it until the correct moment to deploy it arrived. The correct moment arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in the 4th week of October. Gabriella had brought lunch, real lunch, from the Korean place 2 blocks from the Midtown office that Adiz had introduced her to in the 3rd week, Himul Sunjubu Jjigi, which Dorothy regarded with the focused, open-minded attention she brought to any new experience, tasted, and then looked at Gabriella with an expression that communicated a complete paragraph without using a single word. "Korean food," Dorothy said. "Yes." "From near your office." "Yes." Dorothy took another spoonful, set the container on her tray with the deliberate placement of a woman organizing her thoughts alongside her lunch. "Tell me about him," she said. Gabriella looked up from her own container. "I haven't said anything about a him." "No," Dorothy agreed pleasantly. "You haven't said anything about him, that's how I know." What did Dorothy say? Everything. In the particular way of a woman who had raised Gabriella Collins alone, and therefore knew the precise shape of every silence her daughter used as a substitute for the truth. Gabriella told her. Not everything, not the street in Buckhead or the specifics of what Siak's world looked like from its less navigable edges, but the architecture of it. Han Wool and the cream card and the contract and the coffee and the desk that had been replaced without discussion. The envelope, the 4 words, the way he stood when she entered rooms. Dorothy listened the way she always listened, completely, without interruption, with the particular quality of attention that had made Gabriella, from the time she was a child, feel that what she was saying was the most important thing currently being said anywhere. When Gabriella finished, Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "The man values honesty," she said. "In a world that runs on the opposite. And you're treating that like a complication." "I'm treating it like a data point that requires verification," Gabriella said, "given my history with men I trusted professionally." Dorothy looked at her daughter with the direct, undecorated gaze of a woman who had worked 2 jobs for 15 years and did not have patience for the particular kind of self-protection that disguised itself as wisdom. "Callum Rendell was a thief," she said. "Thieves exist in every industry, in every neighborhood, in every tax bracket. The lesson of Callum Rendell is not that trust is structurally unsound." She picked up her tea. "The lesson of Callum Rendell is that you were not paying attention to what he was showing you because you were paying attention to what he was telling you." A pause. "Are you making that mistake with this man?" Gabriella was quiet. "No," she said. "What is he showing you?" She thought about the desk, the coffee, Brower's name on the reinstatement paperwork, the 30 days written notice clause he had proposed before she asked for it, the way he had said I was wrong about the method with the direct accountability of someone for whom honesty was not a performance but a structural requirement. "That he means what he does," she said, "more than what he says." Dorothy nodded once, with the economy of a woman who has made her point and sees no reason to repeat it. "Your father," she said, shifting in the way she shifted when she was moving toward something she had been carrying for a while, "showed me who he was in the first 6 weeks. I spent the next year waiting for him to become someone different." She set the tea down. "I am not telling you to stop being careful. I am telling you that careful and afraid are not the same thing, and you have been treating them like they are since Callum. That is the habit worth examining." She looked at Gabriella directly. not the man. The conversation stayed with her for 3 days. She turned it over on the MARTA, in the margins of documents she was reviewing, in the particular quiet of the office at 7 in the morning before anyone else arrived, which was when she did her best thinking, in the clean, unoccupied hour before the day accumulated its weight. She had agreed to Tuesday at Han Wool. Tuesday arrived. She did not go to Han Wool. Not because she had changed her mind. Because at 6:15 on Tuesday evening, as she was closing the Zurich document and reaching for her coat, Min appeared in her doorway with his phone extended, and his expression arranged in the specific neutral that meant the information he was carrying was not neutral at all. "Langbridge Consulting," he said. "Callum Rendell submitted a professional reference request this afternoon to the Georgia Board of Interpreters and Translators." A pause. "Contesting your reinstatement on the grounds of the original licensing violation." She took the phone. "Read the notification." Set it back on Min's desk. "Where is Siak?" she said. "He left 20 minutes ago," Min said. "Han Wool." "Is Part 2 going to be a war?" She stood in the Midtown office at 6:17 on a Tuesday evening and felt the answer settle into her chest with the particular weight of something that had been approaching for 3 years and had finally arrived at the door. Yes. The only remaining question was whether she was going to meet it alone or not. She took the MARTA to Ponce de Leon and walked the 12 minutes at a pace that had nothing to do with the evening or the October air or the magnolia trees lining the last 2 blocks, their late-season leaves gone amber at the edges in the streetlight, holding the particular beauty of things that are about to change. She stopped at the last magnolia before the turn toward Han Wool's block. She did not know why she stopped. Or rather, she knew, the way you know things that are operating below the level of conscious decision, that she was not ready to walk into that restaurant until she had stood still long enough to finish the thought she had been having for 3 days. Dorothy's question. "What is he showing you?" She stood under the magnolia tree in the amber October dark and answered it honestly, without the architecture of caution she had been building around the answer since she first understood it was there. He had shown her a desk that protected her professionally. Coffee that said, "I paid attention to something small about you because small things are how I pay attention to everything." A contract clause he had added before she asked for it, because he had already thought about what she needed before she said it. 4 Korean words in a cream envelope delivered at personal cost by a man for whom personal cost was not something he permitted lightly. He had shown her, in 7 weeks, more of who he actually was than Callum had shown her in 3 years. Dorothy was right. She was not being careful. She was being afraid. And she had earned the fear, she had paid for it in full, in currency that had taken 3 years to account for. But fear paid forward was not protection. It was just damage, relocated. She was not going to relocate it onto this. She looked at the magnolia tree above her, the branches, the amber-edged leaves, the way the streetlight came through them in the particular pattern of something intricate being illuminated from below. She took out her phone. She called Brower. He answered on the second ring, which told her he had been expecting the call. "Rendell's contest," she said. "I saw it 40 minutes ago," Brower said. "It has no merit. The original licensing violation was expunged from the record when the investigation closed. He has no legal standing to contest a reinstatement on those grounds, and the board's administrative review will confirm that within 72 hours. A pause. However, she said. "He is not filing the contest because he expects it to succeed," Brower said. "He is filing it because he wants you to know he is aware of your reinstatement. It is a communication, not a legal strategy." She stood under the magnolia and let that settle. "He wants me to respond," she said. "He wants you to react," Brower said. "Those are different things. I would strongly recommend the former over the latter." Another pause, the length of a man choosing his next words with the precision she had come to rely on. "There is also the question of Langbridge Consulting's current client list. 2 of their active contracts involve parties that Siak's firm has ongoing relationships with. That is not a coincidence, and it did not happen in the last 3 weeks." She was quiet. He planned this, she said. He planned the proximity, Brower said. What he plans to do with it depends, I suspect, on what you do next. His voice carried the careful, factual warmth of a man who was operating at the boundary of his professional scope and had decided to cross it briefly because the situation warranted it. You are not the same person he left holding the documents, Gabriella. He does not know that yet. That is your advantage. She thanked him. She hung up. She stood under the magnolia tree in the October dark with Atlanta moving around her and felt the specific, clarifying cold of a situation that had finished being abstract and become entirely concrete. Callum Rendell had come back to the city she had rebuilt herself in. He had positioned himself in the professional network she was re-entering. He had filed a legal contest designed not to succeed, but to announce his presence. He was not finished with her. The question, the only question, the one that everything since the Alderaan had been building toward, was whether she was finished with being the person things happened to. She put her phone in her pocket, walked the last half block to Han Wool's unmarked door, climbed the steps. Siak was at the back table. He was standing when she came into his sightline. She crossed the room and sat down and looked at him across the low-lit table and said, without preamble, without the careful architecture of a woman managing her own disclosure, Callum Rendell filed a contest against my reinstatement tonight. It has no legal merit. It is a communication. He has positioned himself inside 2 of your active professional networks, and it has been planned for longer than 3 weeks. She held his gaze. I need to know everything you know about how far back this goes. Siak sat down. The almost smile did not appear. What appeared instead was something she had not seen before, the focused, settled quality of a man who had been waiting for a specific conversation and was ready for it in the way that suggested he had been ready for some time. Everything, he said, not a question, a confirmation, the word of a man honoring a specific prior commitment. Everything, she said. He reached into his jacket, set a folder on the table between them, cream-colored, substantial, the kind of thickness that suggested it had been assembled over time rather than quickly. She looked at it, looked at him. How long have you had this? She said. Since before Han Wool, he said. Since before the Alderaan. The room held its quiet around them. The jazz, the 30-year jiggy, the 6 tables and their private conversations, and the unmarked door that kept all of it off every available map. Where are they going next? She opened the folder. And the answer to that question stopped being about a job, or a contract, or 4 Korean words in a cream envelope. It became about what 2 people who had each, in their separate ways, been failed by the world's indifference to honesty were willing to build together in the space that indifference had left. Callum Rendell was in Atlanta. He had a plan. So did Gabriella Collins. And for the first time in 3 years, she was not making it alone. Before we get to what's inside that folder, I want to take some seconds on something that just happened that is more common in real life than most people realize. What Callum Rendell did with that licensing contest has a name. It is called vexatious filing, and it is a documented legal tactic where someone submits a complaint, contest, or claim not because they expect to win, but because the process itself is the weapon. The goal is not a ruling. The goal is to force the target to spend time, money, and emotional resources defending something that was never a real threat. It happens in professional licensing boards, family courts, and corporate disputes every single day. And the people most vulnerable to it are the ones who have already been through one damaging legal process, because they react to the filing as if it carries the same weight as the original. That reaction is exactly what the filer is counting on. Brower gave Gabriella the most important piece of advice available in that situation. Respond, don't react. Understand the filing's actual legal merit before you let it determine your next move. If you are ever on the receiving end of something that feels like a legal threat, the first call is always to someone who can tell you whether it is one, not to the person who sent it. Now, back to the folder. Part 2 is coming. And the first thing Callum Rendell is going to learn. In a city he thought he knew, in a professional network he thought he'd mapped, is that the woman he left holding the documents has become the woman who reads every room before she enters it. And she has a translator. Subscribe, because the war has a starting gun. It just fired.